Thank you. Yes, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to the final talk tonight, which is a book launch, really, of a book that we are publishing here at Bergen Kunsthall in collaboration with several other institutions and Sternberg Press. It's a book on the work of British artist James Richards. Some of you might have seen the exhibition, the show that was on earlier this year in February, March. James Richards is a British artist working mainly in video, sound, and installation, creating these incredible, complex, multi-layered video collaged works, where often the sound is very important as well. And what was special with the exhibition here in Bergen Kunsthall was maybe that he really took point of departure in the architecture of the exhibition space and made the whole exhibition into kind of a one piece, or as he described it, as an installation smeared and spread across several rooms. The exhibition is a collaboration with the ICA in London and Kestner Gesellschaft in Hanover. So it has it's just closed not long ago in London, and then it's opening soon in early December in Hanover. And the book is a very important part of this whole project as well, and turned into a project on its own. And so this book was not ready when the show was on here in Bergen. It was just recently launched in London. And so it was very nice for us to use this occasion and the Bergen Art Book Fair to have a little launch of the book. And so we have invited, are very happy to be accompanied by Mason Leaver-Yap, who is writer, curator, editor based in Glasgow and Berlin, amongst other places, and who has worked very closely as an editor and collaborator, I'd say, with James on this very special book. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steinar, and thank you to Bergen Kunsthall and the book fair for having me here. My Norwegian is terrible, so I might have to ask somebody like what full size is on the PowerPoint. I don't think I can do that by myself. Is there a special button to learn Norwegian? So it's been really interesting to hear all these different talks tonight that have been, I guess, a lot about forms of circulation and distribution. And I'm talking a little bit more from the perspective of editing in close proximity to art. I guess the talk is largely about a conundrum that James Richards, the artist, and I both had, which was the fact that he makes moving image, and then the fact that we needed to make a book. And so it's a little bit existential about how one does that successfully. And I kind of feel kind of talking to the converted in some ways, but as an editor, I'm very interested in the ways in which people come to books who don't necessarily have any professional affiliation either with printing or with the art world. How do you appeal to them, and how do you engage them in a way that is generous and hopefully inspiring? And I think unless you make books, the making of books, the processes by which things are conceived and budgeted, shaped, sequenced, commissioned, edited, color corrected, shrink wrapped, typeset, wet proofed, printed, and distributed. This is such a kind of hidden endeavor to the passing reader. And books, I think, sometimes reveal and also make opaque the intensities of their own production, and I think that the best books do a bit of both. I've always felt that books have kind of been the best books, or the books that I enjoy the most, are those that are their own worlds. They have their own internal logics and structures and rules. But of course, books are never made in isolation. apart from maybe with George. But yeah, I think what is clear is that in any case, book time, partly because it's collective time, book time also in terms of the duration through which something is made is not like normal time. It is not something that is easily calendared. And decisions are also subject to this very strange time. And they're made under varying degrees of temporal intensity, either through the pressure of an imminent deadline that might have just passed that makes you write quicker, or they might be snap decisions that you need to make on press in order to fix a problem, or maybe they're set in the mind, years prior. Maybe a young artist in art college is having a relationship to collage that is never realized through their video practice until they're a professional artist at showing at Bergen Kunsthall, like Jim. So I'm interested in how the idea of time affects these things hugely, and the temporal relationships between images, text, as well as the basic time of the beginning, middle, and end of a book has I think became quite a central key structuring principle to thinking through what this book should and could be, not least because Jim works in a durational medium, either primarily with moving image, like the video installation that he did with, or sound, which was the other sound installation that he did here previously. And this is a kind of complicated relationship that I want to return to in greater detail later in my talk. But for me, the time of this book is very particular. It was preceded by, I guess, comes out of the duration of a friendship that began in 2007 when Jim and I first met. Together with my friend Richard Burkitt, Richard and I ran a project called Not 60, that was in the ICA in London, and it was an anniversary celebration for 60 years of the ICA, and for reasons that I thought were really great at the time but came to realize were a little bit tricky, we decided to do 60 projects in 6 months. So that was 30 exhibitions and 30 talks / performances in 6 months. So that was an exhibition every 2 weeks. So temporal problem solving has been a kind of key issue for me for a long time. And Jim's exhibition was one of the 60 projects, and it was his first institutional solo show since graduating from college. And this is an image from that show, and I guess it was a beginning of talking, thinking, and I guess collaborating on ideas together. And it's a rare and exceptional privilege to know everything that someone has made. And I actually enjoy this with Jim's work. We've done things together in various forms since this show. We do screenings, showing his work, other people's work. We do writing interviews, as well as sharing work, food, friends, and an apartment. I come from a writer's background. Primarily, I make texts, projects, exhibitions, events with artists, and it was quite natural, I guess, that we would think about doing a book together. I guess we started talking about doing a book in about 2012 or 2013, and there were lots of problems with that idea, not least because neither of us lived in London anymore. I think Jim was on residency in Tokyo at the time, and I had moved to New York. But the major barrier was like the barrier that we all come across, which was that we had no money. So it wasn't really until the opportunity of 3 significant art institutions coming together that stable funds became available to make something on the scale that we had hoped. So the first was this exhibition at Bergen Kunsthall that perhaps many of you saw, and then it recently went to the ICA, as Steiner mentioned, and it's just about to open at Kestner Gesellschaft in Hanover. And as kind of collaborators, we appreciated that there were things to be done between the three institutions, a design studio, a publisher, the contributors to the book. And not every single decision was going to be creative and inspiring, but largely political and practical. So while we did make every decision together, I was doing the politics, and Jim was doing the creative work. So I was working with editing, publishing, budgeting, and Jim was working with collages, sequencing, and collaborating on design. So I guess given this context, we were faced with a number of questions. It wasn't just a question of what should go into the book, but what should the book be? And that, I guess, spawns a whole load of other problems with any kind of art catalogue, like how would it feel, what would it look like, how long should it be? But primarily the practical question was, what was the book for, and what did we want the book to do? And I remember trying to figure this out with Jim and talking about this elderly ticket collector guy that used to work at MoMA just on the door of the MoMA cinema, and he would have this terrible joke. Every time you'd go in, he would take the ticket and he'd say, "Oh, what are you going to see? It doesn't matter. It's the same old story every time." And I have that often that sense with exhibition catalogues by artists, that kind of tedium of knowing exactly what's going to happen when you turn this page. There's going to be like this really long list of thanks. Then there's going to be like the describey essay for the people that didn't see the show. And then there's just going to be like a long series of terrible video stills that are somehow supposed to meant to stand in for the work. But really just represent like something less than a second. So we were really kind of keen to avoid the usual pitfalls of the same old story every time. And we were thinking a lot about the images that might be expected of an exhibition catalogue, but ones that we didn't really want to include necessarily, or ways of working with professional documentation that would kind of queer it in some way or make it seem a little bit more strange, usually in its contingency to other images. So we were kind of looking at, where are we going? Images like this. Why should an image like this, which is exceptional and beautiful, be privileged over an image like this? When both are about making and both are about exhibiting, and the work is featured in both images. One is considered appropriate, one is considered inappropriate. The same goes for like, why is this an interesting image? It just shows that the artist worked really hard and people have turned up, as opposed to something like this, which is, I think, personally far more compelling and actually speaks to the processes of the work, the processes of thinking and looking. So I guess at the heart of the question was, how does this practice that is focused so intensely on the idea of montage, of strange time, of sound and the senses, appeal to the static nature of the printed page? And we had to kind of come up with a different approach, one that would appease the funders. And I think that that's actually, I don't mean that in a tall pejorative sense. I think it's really important that people who put money in, and there was a private patron who was putting money in, know what they are participating in and not only get what they want, but more than what they want, just not what they don't want. So we were interested in playing with the idea of an exhibition catalogue, but also kind of keeping the spirit or the ethos of an artist's book, something that should have its own autonomy within the practice, but also something that would be really new for Jim, who really doesn't work with printed matter. And has worked almost exclusively with video and sound for the past few years. So just, I guess about this time last year, we started having a conversation with a designer, and we were really keen that they would be based in Berlin, where Jim and later I would live. So being able to sit down at a table and like look at books and touch paper stocks and try and figure out what shades of silver should be used and drink too much coffee together. These things are really important, I think, for figuring out relationships and cannot really be substituted by Skype. I'd frequently worked with, sorry to jump back through, I'd frequently worked with Hit Studio. They were two female designers who were originally based in London, who later moved to Berlin. And they had designed a magazine that I'd worked for. I don't know if I've got an image of it, maybe not. But they designed this book, which was kind of a useful way of thinking through what Jim and I were going to do. This was a book that I'd edited with a number of artists who all worked with moving image, and the subject of the book was to interrogate ways in which we could transpose the moving image viably and interestingly and compellingly into printed matter. And this was a fairly aggressive thing. The only thing that I regret about this book of working with 8 different artists in the same book was that we didn't actually just like rip it into 8 pieces so everybody would have their own autonomy. But it's in its second printing, so it's not so bad. Annetta Lux, who I worked with on the book with Jim, she has this incredible, spontaneous and playful relationship to images and text, and has, I think, an incredibly uncommon and rare ability to have a thoughtfulness in relation to artistic practice. And there was a kind of flexibility and empathy that we really needed on top of killer design. And I think it was clear that Annetta wanted to work in that way, and we did too. So we started looking at books that we liked. This is a beautiful, actually also an exhibition catalogue, a beautiful exhibition catalogue by one of my favorite artists, Michael Fullerton. He's a portrait painter of sorts, I suppose. But this book was incredibly, had an incredibly porous relationship between his own very fine paintings and his research images, kind of found phrases, texts, captioning. It's a really complex book, and if you ever have the fortune to buy a copy, I suggest you do. It's quite something. The other books were Henrik Oleson's How Do I Make Myself a Body? Lucy McKenzie's books, her books are almost exclusively designed by Hit Studio as well, and Mark Camille Shamovitz, who we shamelessly ripped off in terms of this book on the right, Celebration Real Life. It had this incredibly bouncy silver page that was both kind of kitsch, a little bit embarrassing, and kind of melancholic in the same way. And we wanted to kind of use this to a certain effect that I'll refer to later. So as those who make books will probably confess to as well, I think publishing can be a deeply emotional process. And when combined with an artistic practice by Jim's that really trades not on narrative enthrallment, but emotional affect at large, we wanted the book to reflect the various intimacies of making work and experiencing the work. So we had this desire to enjoin the artist and the reader, kind of by using other readers, I suppose, by which I mean the writers who came to view Jim's work as anonymous audience members, each themselves. Chris McCormick, who wrote one of the texts, actually attended the 2007 exhibitions that I showed you previously at the ICA, and got to know Jim after that period. So together we had about 5 texts in the book, and all of them were kind of remarkable in the sense in which they really kind of revealed and mirrored this very emo, experiential sense of affect. And while this wasn't entirely predetermined, we kind of carefully and gently drew out certain conversations that invited them into thinking through such concerns of emotion, relation, intimacy, and belief. And it's to these writers that I'd like to quote from kind of extensively now. Is the dream the most sophisticated form of thought? Yes, whether you're awake or asleep. The dream can never be fully comprehended because it is more complex than consciousness. You cannot understand the ocean in which you are swimming with all the other disagreeable creatures, though some of them you can fuck, and some of them you can eat. Some of them are pretty to look at, and many are easy to ignore. The ocean is the subconscious, but also the city and also television. It is not yet the internet, but it may be soon, with higher bandwidth. Maternal enigmatic signifiers, barebacked out of existence. That other which will keep us perpetually off balance by sustaining the rift between what we know and what we might know if we were not so clumsy and forgetful. After waking in the same conveniently located bed at 3 a.m, dressed in thick layers of soft clothing to avoid building the same layer of ice that had amassed over the inside of the room's windows, we left for the airport. Had we fallen asleep listening to Morton Feldman's looped voices or Brian Eno's music for airports? Arriving early and penalised for not printing our boarding passes for the budget flight, Jim turned amid the low heat and dim hum of the overpopulated hangar and said, "The good thing about these moments is that you never remember them." I remember wondering if this would be true and partly wanted it to be so. We walked past the various heavy plastics that define doorways and bins in the all too specific action-describing colours of red and green when a policeman stopped Jim on the way through passport control, which I had imperceptibly passed. I knew this might be due to the fact that Jim had a menacing bruise over his left eye, incurred by an unprovoked attack back home one night. I had an urge to kiss him on the cheek and undo the picture. I thought of asking him if he wanted something, the ambition of which the airport could not realise. Perhaps this line of thinking was transparent. While waiting for the name search to clear via Interpol, the policeman turned, looked at me bitingly and asked, "Is he with you?" As someone, I guess, who considers themselves first and foremost a writer before any of my other occupations, I particularly hate the idea that an essay or a piece of text is only relevant once, or only needs to be republished if it's kind of already popular and kind of doing the rounds. I think so much writing is produced, a lot of it not very good, that when on the rare occasion it's excellent, it should always be celebrated more than once. And reprinting essays is not uncommon in art catalogues, I suppose, but it is rare in catalogues by younger artists. I don't think it's really by accident that the two extracts that I just read out were actually both the. I guess there's 3 reprinted texts in the book, but these were 2. And I think that their relevance really hasn't waned in relation to Jim's practice, despite the fact that they're getting kind of old. I think 2011 and 2012 for a young practice that has been quite prolific. If anything, they've just become kind of more unique voices in the discussion of Jim's practice as it's gone on. But the reason I chose these 2 texts actually was because they touch upon a structuring principle of the book that I kind of mentioned earlier, the idea of temporality. And I was really interested in talking with Jim and exploring with Jim this muddy movement between beginning, middle, and end, which is a structure shared by video, by sound, by printed matter, but maybe not by something like painting or sculpture. So how does one kind of create, traverse, undo, and return to these principles of beginning, middle, and end, and as well as understand how images that we sequence together might affect that experience. And I think maybe I'll actually show you the book. That would be a nice thing to do. How do I do that amazing thing where it goes into slideshow? Do I do like at the bottom here? Thank you. Crowdsourced knowledge, I love it. So Dream Space was really highly significant to the publication. The idea of dreaming, or maybe not so much dreaming, but that space, where you're not quite awake or asleep. Effects of anesthesia, interstitial spaces of memory, grey zones of things that you can't quite remember. These have long been key themes within Jim's practice, but they were a way of thinking through an attitude or a tone of the book. The choice of silver, which is coming up as grey here, and which we took from Mark Camille, was a way of trying to indicate some of the oddness of the book. It was the silver that we ended up choosing was both it was warmer rather than cold, kind of more like a blanket than something metallic. It was, but it was strangely reflective and opaque, and we thought about it as a kind of haze through which things could be mounted. You just saw there this Stuart Marshall flip phrase, which we took from one of Marshall's videos, and the phrase is, "Under the table make no sign, wrapped in clouds and none the wiser." And it's a kind of a deeply enigmatic phrase that becomes clear in the video for different reasons, but for the purposes of this book here, we were interested in indicating kind of ambiguous and slippery movement through a space of submerged, almost kind of swampy desire, what goes on under the table. And this is not just to say that the book is kind of like some kind of like amazing, unmoored, dreamy space with no desire to be structured. But actually, we kind of counterpointed this this idea of kind of half memory with the notion of the score. You might have seen at the beginning of the talk there was an image of the front cover of the book designed by Hit and resembles what you would see on the beginning of a score or sheet music, where the title is kind of unnaturally high, and then the image itself is a very kind of cartoonish, grimy detail, which is actually the internal diagram of a human ear. So musical notation, was I guess. Or the auditory is implied from the very beginning of the book. And in terms of how we thought about score and how that should have been developed, we actually used the video that was shown here, Radio at Night. It was a work that I commissioned. I have another job at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And I commissioned Jim to make a video there, which became Radio at Night. But we were interested in like literally what it would be to transpose this video into a score and then use the score as a structuring principle for all the materials of the book. So it was this desire to get away from the torture of exhibition catalogs with video stills. That I really can't stand. So we basically sat down and watched through the video, I don't know how many times, and obviously at that point we had seen it probably about 100 times before, but we each developed our own kind of scoring technique and combined these. It was not technical in any way, it was very impressionistic, but it kind of raised questions like, did the video feel loose at the beginning? Was it kind of somehow restrained in its color palette? Well, in that case, the book will match this, and it will match the duration. If if the video at the beginning feels unreasonably long, which it does, then we will begin with an unreasonably long and slightly boring start to the book. Where do the climaxes come in the video? Well, in that case, we will have a moment of proliferation of aggressive imagery that will become almost unbearable, or maybe that things will become more abstract. And so this way of structuring the book as a transposition of one of his videos gave us a scaffold on which to hang our various contents, our contributions, the collages. And the structure put in motion, I guess, a certain democracy in relationship to the images that we used. Some were found, some were personal images shot on phones. They were screen grabs. They were not even Jim's images. They were things sent over WhatsApp by other people. And we wanted to equate the usefulness of these images with the professional still or the professional documentation, and to find a way of where, like, trying to figure out where the work is. Is it studio space? Is it traveling space? Like the space of an airport? Is it social space? Screen space, exhibition space. And we wanted to kind of infuse, I guess, and distract the hermetic nature of exhibition catalogue photography, and in so doing produce a work alongside the exhibition that indicated work as a way of living. The world of practice is all-encompassing for the artist in question, but I guess we were interested in finding a way of having the book be an aperture onto that world, something that would be intimate and, even potentially claustrophobic relationship to making and to working as a way of speaking about the work itself. And central to this idea were the collages. You're kind of seeing like the final sequence of them here. And you know, these were a bit of a black hole for the process of making. Jim would just go into the studio for weeks and just be tinkering with them, and they were made through both analog and digital techniques. It was a kind of space of figurative abstraction of smears, wipes, and a space which was a surface that would every now and then rupture. And these collages stitched together the other facets of the books, you know, the found texts, the standalone images, the iPhone snaps, as well as the essays. In essence, the collages actually became a new work, and we decided to list them as such in the back of the book. Oh, talking of which, the appendix. So the back of the book is, you know, I guess something to those who are not in the profession is the least interesting part of any publication. But actually, if nobody's watching, if it's the first thing I turn to, I might look at the cover, but it's like this page is like the first thing. We're looping back round to the beginning again shortly. But that colophon is so interesting to me. It's about the acknowledgement sections. Just reveal the structure of reliance, of friendships, of connections that weave in and out of the book. You know, where was it printed? Who designed it? Who paid for it? These are all kind of questions that make the book what it is. And then it's really interesting to kind of have that image in your head and then go back to the beginning and see whether or not that was such an inevitable thing in the first place. But the back matter of the book for us, this is the final page. The back matter of the book served for us as a kind of important addendum by kind of adding, I guess, an exhaustive credit to every single image in the back. It allowed us to be free of the tedium of captioning, and it allowed us to be quite intuitive and collagistic and free with the way in which images should be used, and in some cases repeated aggressively. But the appendix is very important for giving provenance. For instance, we used this amazing poem by this lesbian West Coast American poet, Judy Grahn, who's still alive and making incredible poems. But she had always been quite a touchstone for Jim in his videos, because his videos never had any credits. You know, there was this complicated task of making sure that she was in some way credited. And so we inserted her in the book, and she asked to fly out to Bergen and London and Hanover, but we'll have to figure out a way of visiting her in San Francisco instead. But I hope that she likes the book. But it was important for us to include her poetry in the stream of consciousness that Jim had first made the book, without getting hung up on proper nouns, signifying a way out of the logic of the book as a whole. So I thought I would kind of try and end on that part on the back of the book. But I've got an addendum to add, which is that the book, despite now being printed and in circulation, is somehow not over. And I think books kind of somehow are never over. And not least because I'm still talking about it with you now. But the final iteration of the show in Kestner Gesellschaft is adding a section to the book, one which includes texts, images, and material on a new work that was created in the process of making the book, and will be exhibited. It's a collaborative work that will be exhibited in Kestner Gesellschaft. It's a video by Leslie Thornton, who is a New York-based video artist, kind of older, very interesting filmmaker, who Jim has been working with over the past 4 years. But, you know, I think that it's kind of interesting. I haven't seen this addendum, but it's at the printers. And I think it's kind of one of these things that you make these books and you think it's over, but it's never ending. And I think maybe that's the best way to end this evening. Something that's still in process and unfolding. So thank you very much. The book is available at the reception, and it's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Mason.
So sorry.
But James would be here if he wasn't making the other part of the book.
I'm sorry, Mason.
I'm wearing his sweater, so it's kind of fine. You might get confused.
just been running from my studio and back again because there was like a burglar there, so the alarm went. So I'm a little bit. My body is like all over the place. So, but thank you for giving us this look into the process of the book. It's very interesting to listen to this. All the decisions that are made during it. So that was really great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there any questions in the audience to Mason?
I'm happy to field questions at the bar too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the table is inside the ink store that we have turned out to a small part of the fair, and it's at the ink table. You can get this book, and I think it's really nice to have you present this. This has been a exhibition on the house. It's a book produced on the house, and it's nice to also like have it a part of the art book fair. So we are really happy that you took the trip.
Thanks, me too.
Yeah.